Winston Churchill sat alone in the dim light of Admiralty House. The rhythmic ticking of a clock, the only sound in a room heavy with the scent of cigar smoke and old parchment. For years, he had been a lone voice crying out in the wilderness, warning of a predatory shadow lengthening across Europe. Tonight, the warning had ended. The nightmare had begun. As the sun began to rise over the Thames, word reached him. The Wehrmacht had breached the borders of the Low Countries. The phony war was over. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler, buoyed by the rapid fall of Poland, was now unleashing a mechanical juggernaut the likes of which the world had never seen. This was no longer a war of trenches and stagnant lines. It was a war of momentum, steel, and industrial will. Churchill knew that Britain stood on the precipice of annihilation. The German Blitzkrieg was not merely a military tactic. It was a symphony of integrated technology. While Churchill scrambled to mobilize a nation that was still psychologically recovering from the trauma of the Great War, Hitler's engineers were already perfecting the tools of total conquest. From the roar of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers to the clattering tracks of the Panzer divisions, the Third Reich had spent years forging a blade designed to decapitate empires in weeks. The stakes were absolute. This was a duel between two diametrically opposed visions of the world, fought through the medium of machines. For Hitler, victory lay in the aggressive, crushing power of the tank and the psychological terror of the Luftwaffe. For Churchill, survival depended on the wooden decks of the Royal Navy and the thin, soaring grace of the Spitfire. The ocean was wide, but the steel was fast. As Churchill prepared to walk to Buckingham Palace to accept the King's commission as Prime Minister, he knew that the fate of Western civilization would be decided not just by the courage of men, but by the performance of the engines they commanded. May 14, 1940. The Ardennes Forest, France. General Heinz Guderian peered through binoculars at a sight that military logic dictated should have been impossible. Below him, a sea of gray-painted steel choked the narrow, winding forest tracks of the Ardennes. To the French High Command, this region was impenetrable, a natural fortress that rendered the heavy fortifications of the Maginot Line invincible. They were wrong. Hitler had gambled the fate of the Reich on a radical evolution of the internal combustion engine, the Panzer. While Churchill's cabinet in London debated the evacuation of forces, the German Panzer IIs and IIIs were rewriting the laws of physics on the battlefield. This wasn't just about the thickness of armor or the caliber of the guns. It was about synchronization. Every German tank was equipped with radio, a revolutionary advantage that allowed commanders to coordinate movements in real time, turning a chaotic mass of machinery into a single predatory organism. Above them, the Stukas acted as flying artillery, screaming down from the clouds with sirens designed to shatter the morale of the soldiers below before a single bomb even hit the earth. The French and British tanks were often technically superior in a one-on-one fight, but they were being outpaced and outthought. By the time Churchill flew to Paris on May 16th to meet with the French premier, the situation was catastrophic. He asked the French commander-in-chief Gamelin, "Where's the strategic reserve?" The answer haunted him. "There is none." The steel scythe of the Wehrmacht had sliced through the Allied center, racing toward the English Channel. Churchill realized with chilling clarity that his army was about to be trapped against the sea at a small fishing port called Dunkirk. The survival of the British Empire now rested on whether their ships could reach the shore before the panzers finished the job. The war of the land was being lost. The war of the waves was about to begin. June 4th, 1940. The English Channel. As the final destroyer pulled away from the blood-soaked sands of Dunkirk, Winston Churchill stood in the map room of the Admiralty, staring at a miracle that felt like a defeat. Against all odds, nearly 340,000 men had been snatched from the jaws of the panzers. But the cost was staggering. Left behind on the beaches were 2,500 heavy guns, 60,000 vehicles, and nearly 700 tanks, the charred skeletal remains of Britain's mechanized power. Churchill knew that while they had saved the men, they had lost the tools to protect the island. Hitler, now the undisputed master of Western Europe, looked toward the white cliffs of Dover with a predatory gaze. To launch Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, he needed to solve a dual problem of physics and firepower. His panzers were kings of the land, But they were useless unless he could ferry them across the channel. Standing in his way was the Royal Navy, a force of legendary proportions. Churchill's wooden walls had evolved into steel behemoths. The battleships and destroyers that formed a lethal barrier Hitler's Kriegsmarine could not hope to break in a direct confrontation. To neutralize the ships, Hitler turned to the air. The Luftwaffe, led by the vainglorious Hermann Göring, was tasked with a singular mission: achieve total air superiority. If the German planes could sink the British fleet and clear the skies, the invasion would begin. Throughout the sweltering summer of 1940, the focus of the war shifted from the mud of France to the cockpit of the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. These were Churchill's shields of the realm. Unlike the German Bf-109s, which had limited fuel capacity and could only stay over England for minutes, the British fighters were defending their own nests. Every morning, young pilots, some barely 20 years old, climbed into their machines, fueled by high-octane petrol and the desperate knowledge that if they failed, the hum of German engines would soon be heard in the streets of London. September 15th, 1940. The skies over southern England. Winston Churchill descended into the cramped, subterranean bunker of No. 11 Group Fighter Command. The air was thick with tension and the smell of ozone. On the giant table map below, WAF officers pushed wooden blocks representing incoming German raids, massive waves of Dornier bombers and Messerschmitt fighters. This was the climax of the Battle of Britain. Hitler had shifted his strategy from attacking airfields to the systematic firebombing of London, a gamble designed to break the British spirit and lure the last of the RAF into a final, fatal engagement. But Churchill had a secret weapon that Hitler's intelligence had catastrophically undervalued. Chainholm. A series of towering radio masts along the coast acted as an invisible radar shield, allowing British controllers to vector their precious few Spitfires and Hurricanes with surgical precision. The Germans were flying blind into a trap. In the cockpits, the physical toll was immense. British pilots were flying 5, 6, 7 sorties a day. The Merlin engines of their Spitfires screamed under the strain of high G turns, their airframes riddled with 20mm cannon fire. By sunset, the sky was a canvas of white contrails and oily black smoke. The Luftwaffe had suffered a crushing blow, losing nearly 60 aircraft in a single afternoon. Hitler, realizing that his planes could not clear the path for his panzers, indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion. The greatest air battle in history had been won by a hair's breadth. However, as the threat of invasion faded, a more insidious menace emerged from the depths of the Atlantic. Hitler knew he didn't need to set foot on British soil to win. He just had to star the island. He turned to the gray wolves, the U-boat wolf packs. These sleek, underwater predators began to prowl the shipping lanes, targeting the merchant vessels bringing food and fuel from America. Churchill would later admit that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. The battle was shifting from the clouds to the crushing pressures of the deep Atlantic. May 24th, 1941, the North Atlantic. The HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, vanished in a pillar of fire that rose 600 feet into the air. A single salvo from the Bismarck, Hitler's massive new battleship, had torn the British icon in half. In London, Churchill received the news with a grim, stony silence. The Bismarck represented the ultimate evolution of German surface power, a floating fortress designed to sever Britain's Atlantic lifeline. But the era of the battleship was dying. Churchill ordered every available asset to sink the Bismarck, and it wasn't a bigger gun that did it. It was a swarm of antiquated biplanes launched from an aircraft carrier. This moment signaled a permanent shift in the war of machines. Churchill knew that to defeat Hitler, he had to outproduce him. While Hitler's engineers focused on wonder weapons and over-engineered giants like the Tiger tank, which were formidable but difficult to repair and few in number, Churchill and his new ally, the United States, turned toward the arsenal of democracy. The war was now a contest of industrial endurance. For every panzer Hitler sent to the front, the Allies began churning out 10 Sherman and Cromwell tanks. For every U-boat that prowled the Atlantic, new Liberty ships were being built in American shipyards in a matter of days. Churchill's strategy was no longer just about survival. It was about overwhelming the Reich with a tide of mass-produced steel. By 1944, the skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe were crowded with thousands of Allied bombers, and the English Channel, once a barrier to save Britain, became the highway for the liberation of Europe. The duel between Churchill and Hitler was ultimately decided by the philosophy of their machines. Hitler sought the perfect, terrifying weapon to win a quick victory. Churchill embraced the relentless, inexorable power of global industry. As the Red Army's T-34s closed in from the east and Allied Mustangs roared over Berlin, the mechanical heart of the Third Reich finally seized. Churchill had gambled on the long game, and in the end, the sheer weight of his great alliance had crushed the steel dream of the Fuhrer.